Thank you so much. Welcome to Chautauqua Institution, Chautauqua County, and the Jackson Center.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've had, I know, a really brief tour, look at Chautauqua Institution. Do you have any initial impressions?
It's wonderful to see so much memorabilia and honoring of Robert Jackson in his different roles. And we were very struck by the flagpole outside with the different quotations representing two of the important facets of Jackson's career, Nuremberg and his opinion in West Virginia versus Barnett. So we're very impressed with that, and also with the statue outside.
Stories behind all of them, but I won't bore you with that. So I'm just delighted to hear, but you're originally from where? Where's your hometown?
I was just telling John Barrett about this. I was born in Newark, New Jersey, grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, and then eventually went off for college and never went back to New Jersey. So now in Washington, D.C. area is home. I've lived outside of D.C. since 1986.
So growing up in New Jersey, what was it? The Yankees, the Mets, where did you go?
More the Yankees.
Yep. Sets a tone. Were you destined to be a lawyer?
Probably. I think that I was a very argumentative kid and always ready to take either side of an argument, although I did not think very much about being a lawyer until my sister, who's older than me by 2 years and 10 months, went to law school and inspired me to follow in her footsteps.
Were either of your parents engaged in the law at all?
Neither one. My dad was a research scientist and my mom was an elementary school teacher, and they combined to have many characteristics that go with good lawyering: empathy and persuasion and communication skills. And my dad had a very rigorous outlook on all things, and he later became one of my best sounding boards in preparing for a Supreme Court argument. I would lay out for him the position that I was trying to articulate, and not being a lawyer, I had to make it very intelligible to him, and he always succeeded asking questions about things that I would not have thought of on my own and that were critical to conveying the essence of the case.
Did he submit an invoice in all of this?
He did it just purely for the love of it.
So now one of your consultants there you're bringing. So your academic career, college?
I went to undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I was a history major. I probably would have gravitated to philosophy if I had stayed a couple of more years, but unfortunately I had to graduate and go on to do other things, and I spent a year at graduate school at the University of Chicago studying European intellectual history, and the career path on that was not entirely promising. So at that point I switched over to law school, and I went to Duke University School of Law for law.
And you'll see a few Duke alums here today. You may have met one. I know you met one earlier, so that's
indeed.
You'll be in comfortable territory. You graduate from Duke with honors, and just you knocked it out of the park. Was there a logical path after that?
There is, for most people who want to continue the sort of academic and intellectual side of law, and that is clerking for an appellate judge. And I clerked for Judge Jerry S. Williams in Austin, Texas, who was on his second year in the court, and I was very excited to be one of his first law clerks, thinking I would help him learn the ropes and formulate jurisprudential views. But it turned out that he had been an academic for 40 years and he knew what he thought about almost everything. So I learned a lot from him. I'm not entirely sure whether he got his money's worth from me. And during that year, I went to see a movie called Prince of the City, which was about New York corruption and federal prosecutors who handled it. And I became inspired to be a part of the Justice Department in the criminal division. And it ultimately took me 6 years to get to the Justice Department. I didn't go to the criminal division. I went to the office of the Solicitor General, where Robert Jackson was Solicitor General many years before, and thought that I would go to the Justice Department for a couple of years and then come out and engage in private practice, and ended up staying for more than 30.
How does one just become part of the Solicitor General's office? Apply and interview? Is this the normal process?
Purely getting struck by lightning. I, at the time, had two friends who were in the office, and one person who was a deputy solicitor general who had been a partner at the law firm that I worked at, and I did not know him very well, but he apparently knew me by reputation. And without the support of those insiders, I'm quite confident that I never would have gotten the chance to be in the SG's office. It's a pure appellate shop, and it is the cream of the profession for appellate work. And I had done only 2 appellate cases. I had lost them both. So it was, for me, a pretty significant transformation of what I was doing. And I felt very fortunate to get there and very intimidated by the people that I worked with.
Were there mentors to you that sort of took you under their wings and showed you the ropes?
Fortunately, yes. There were people in the office who came and guided me on how to navigate the process of working with the federal government, preparing briefs for the Supreme Court, how to read briefs as models, how to learn how to write a brief. Nobody sits down and just tells you that, but you can see it from example. And one of the deputies, Bill Bryson, who was the deputy handling criminal work and later became a judge on the federal circuit, became a mentor of mine, and I ultimately took his position when he left the department to become a judge.
Is there a manual of how writing briefs? I know in the law firms, of which I am part, we sort of have a writer's manual. Here's what anything you're going to write. Here's how it should look.
There really isn't. You learn how to write a brief by, number one, reading excellent briefs and taking them apart, either consciously or unconsciously. You could do that by outlining them, which would be a very methodical approach to learning how to write a brief, or you could just read a lot of them and hope that by osmosis you gain the same skills. But the other, and probably the major teaching tool, is the Deputy Solicitors General, and often the Solicitor General, him or herself, is an amazing editor. And if you watch carefully what you do with your draft and then how it comes back, you can learn a ton. I can remember one brief that I wrote, a reply brief in a Supreme Court merits case, and I wrote 6 beautiful pages describing all of our arguments. And when the brief came back, those 6 pages were all crossed out. And the brief then started right at the heart of the argument. I learned a lot from that experience.
For the camera, because basically people who will watch this will be students and interested people, and they'll see your resume regarding being in the Solicitor General's office, but frankly not know much about what a Solicitor General's office does. Could you kind of give us a understanding of what that is?
So the Solicitor General is the 4th ranking official in the Department of Justice, but has a very unique function. The Solicitor General by statute is to be learned in the law. And that reflects that the Solicitor General is the primary advocate for the United States government in the Supreme Court of the United States. Often the Solicitor General has been called the 10th Justice. As many Solicitors General like to joke, they don't actually get a vote, and no justice on the Supreme Court ever uses that phrase. But the significance of it is that it's a dual role. It's representing the executive branch and the people of the United States, but it is also playing a role in the development of the law through the highest court in the land's articulation of what the law should be. So you need to think beyond technical jurisprudence to important policy consequences of the Supreme Court's decisions and the court's role as articulating fundamental values for the country in areas where traditional tools of legal analysis do not generally yield a consensus answer. So it requires extraordinary candor. It requires a sense of responsibility to the court as an institution. And it teaches you something that all lawyers need to learn, which is one of your most important assets is your reputation for credibility and integrity. And those mean that even if you could take a shortcut to try to win a case, suppress a case citation or slide over the facts, in the long run, that is not what it means to be a lawyer for the United States, and I think by extension, not what it means to be a lawyer for any client.
Does the Supreme Court have occasion to reach out to the Solicitor General's office and seek an amicus, a brief?
Absolutely. Many times a term, the court will get a petition for certiorari from a party requesting the court to hear a case that involves an issue of federal law in which the United States has an interest, whether it's securities enforcement or international relations or some obscure corner of tax law or ERISA law. And the court will file what's called an invitation to the Solicitor General to express the views of the United States. And at that point, the government truly is acting as a friend of the court, always, of course, serving the client interests of the United States, but the court is asking for advice and a recommendation. The more important piece of that kind of a brief is candid advice. The recommendation, the court will take or leave. It doesn't follow the Solicitor General's advice without its own critical lens on top of it. And of course, for the Supreme Court to grant a case, 4 justices out of 9 have to agree. If there's an invitation to the Solicitor General, that shows you there aren't 4 justices ready to grant. And so one of them has to be persuaded to change his or her mind. That's often a difficult thing. But in technical areas of law or areas of law that involve unique federal interests, the court does pay very careful attention to the United States. And one other area that just is reflective of the importance that the court places on candid advice and advocacy from the SG, the Solicitor General is the only non-party who is routinely afforded the opportunity to argue a case as an amicus curiae. Private amici are routinely turned down in that opportunity, but the court often wants to test the views of the government by hearing from the government's lawyer in the argument. It's just another reminder that it's a special role. It's not a role as an ordinary lawyer. It's reinforced by the trappings of the garb that one wears. Men traditionally wear morning suits. Some women do as well. Other women prefer to wear business suits. But when you put on a morning suit and you stand up in front of the Supreme Court, it is a reminder that you're there as the representative of a government, and it is both sobering and hopefully clarifying.
Do you remember the first time in morning suit you said, "May it please the court"?
Oh, I remember it very well. I stood up and I was wearing a hand-me-down pair of pants for my morning suit that came probably mid-calf. And I stood up and began my argument, and around 20 seconds into it, Justice Scalia cracked a joke and the entire courtroom burst out in laughter. I was not sure whether this was because of the length of my pants or because they thought that Justice Scalia was funny. But it actually sort of took some of the pressure off of standing up and looking at the justices. You're very close to them in the Supreme Court. You can see their facial expressions very clearly, and they don't hide their reactions. Maybe they don't care, whether you notice, but you can tell whether an argument is landing. You can see when Justice Scalia would sort of run his hand through his hair and then move up to the microphone, a very terrifying experience for a young lawyer. My first argument was memorable in part because it was also the first argument of another young lawyer who was just cutting his teeth in private practice. And that young lawyer was John Roberts, future Chief Justice of the United States. He and I were probably in a close competition for who was more nervous. He was white as a sheet. I was very rigidly sitting in my chair. And right before the whistle blew to announce that the justices were coming into court, he leaned over behind the podium and in a very hoarse voice said to me, "Do you want to settle?"
With tongue in cheek?
Deeply.
Was it Hogan and Hartson at the time?
It was.
It was, yeah. I would just digress a little bit, but one of his mentors was E. Barrett Prettyman Jr.
Yes.
Last law clerk for Robert Jackson, and a board member here.
Yes.
Did your paths ever cross with his?
I never had the pleasure of meeting or working with E. Barrett Prettyman. Of course, John Roberts has another connection to Jackson. He clerked for Rehnquist, and Rehnquist was a Jackson clerk. And the kind of intellectual and jurisprudential heritage, particularly from the steel seizure case, was transferred down to Roberts and ended up informing things that Roberts did as Chief Justice.
And just as a postscript, we had both of them here at the Jackson Center. One to dedicate the facility and one on the 10th anniversary of the dedication to the day. Do you see the Solicitor General's office, again going to its function, who decides the cases you're going to argue? I mean, is it the Attorney General that says, all right, we're going to take this up, or how does that really work? Because it's part of the executive branch. How does it work internally?
So the Solicitor General's office is really a very small office when you consider the volume of litigation that it has to handle. There is one Solicitor General who is presidentially appointed and Senate confirmed. There is one Deputy Solicitor General who is politically appointed but not a presidentially appointed Senate confirmed official, and everybody else in the office traditionally is career. There are 4 career deputies and about 15 career assistants. So that's a tiny cadre of people to handle well over 2,000-3,000 cases a year, most of which are on petition for certiorari, not on the merits. When the cases are on the merits, presumptively the Solicitor General is making all of the decisions, including what positions the United States should take, who will work on the brief, who will argue the case. And the Solicitor General relies on advice from the deputies and the assistants, largely in writing, but also in personal conversations. And within the Department of Justice, Solicitors General navigate their relationship with the Attorney General in different ways. One of the models is complete transparency because, as your question indicated, the Attorney General is the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States, has the authority to take over a Supreme Court case if he or she wished, and has final decision-making authority unless overruled by the President. But for the most part, attorneys general have a lot to do, and they recognize that the Solicitor General, by both training and position, is best positioned to understand how to achieve the aims of the United States in the Supreme Court. So traditionally, Solicitors General have tremendous autonomy in carrying out that role. And the lawyers in the office have a fair degree of autonomy in working with the client agencies, working with the components of the department to help formulate the positions of the United States.
You've had some pretty big cases.
I've had some pretty good cases and some that we would traditionally call dogs.
But some which have gotten, had some publicity along the way, and including, and I should pause probably here, we are reading this, From 2017 to 2019, you were detailed to serve as counselor to Special Counsel Robert Mueller III in the investigation of the Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election and obstruction of justice. Now, that was during a time you're obviously still with the Solicitor General's office. Did somebody come up and call you one day and say, hey, how would you like to be part of Counsel Mueller's office?
That was probably the most important criminal investigation that the United States had conducted in many years. And I had been the Deputy Solicitor General responsible for criminal law for quite a while. Mueller was known for trying to pull talent for the teams that he worked on. He had been the U.S. Attorney in San Francisco and in Boston. He had been the Director of the FBI. And in all of those positions, he was very good at spotting people who he wanted to hire and then delegating responsibility to them. So when that investigation began to get rolling, he hired a number of people who I knew, and I called them up and asked whether they were going to bring on an appellate specialist. And there was a long pause, and they said, well, we were just about to call you. So I went over for an interview with Bob Mueller and his two top deputies, and they were describing a very difficult negotiation that was going on with the White House about getting access to information about the president's communications with the various cabinet officers relating to Russia and the allegations that Russia had interfered in the election. And we got into a pretty deep conversation about the scope of executive privilege within the executive branch and how this should be handled and analyzed. And Mueller said at the end of it and said, well, this looks like it's going to work. When would you like to start? And I said, well, I think I just did.
What was your role as part of this? Now, you're basically an appellate person, which means it's got to work its way through the courts. And is that where you kick in? You're not in the investigative process. You're when they prepared the case, and you're the guy that's going to take it to the court. Am I oversimplifying that?
That you're not oversimplifying it, but my role in that investigation was a little bit different because we were, as one of my colleagues said, building the plane and flying it at the same time. It was putting together an investigation that involved recruiting FBI agents, recruiting experts in money laundering, recruiting experts in political corruption, because there were many different facets to this investigation, international connotations that had to be particularly analyzed with people who were expert. And the one thing that Mueller wanted to do, and I should say here that I called him Bob Mueller, but I rarely called him Bob to his face, no matter how many times he asked. We veered between the boss and the director, because he had been the director of the FBI, and he was a very formidable character who could be quite intimidating, but also someone who had a great deal of empathy and human concern. His role, his motto was, we're going to stick squarely within the four corners of the law. So one of my roles was to make sure that any investigatory avenue that we were going down would hold up if it reached the Supreme Court. We weren't looking for novel legal theories. We were looking for solid legal positions that the department would endorse and that the Supreme Court would uphold if it got there.
You may not even want to comment on this, but did you see because this, again, you're part of the executive branch in the sequence of life, and at the same time you're asking for information from that same executive branch, and at the top is the president, and they may or may not be cooperative, and how you navigated that, or interference with, or, because in one sense you're a special prosecution, supposedly completely independent, but in this case, are you?
It's a great question, and it's played out differently in different investigations over time. We were not completely independent. We were operating within the Department of Justice. We were bound by Department of Justice policies and legal positions. The Department of Justice had the right to find out what the special counsel was doing in most areas and could override the special counsel under a very rigorous standard that required giving a lot of deference to the special counsel's decisions. But it was often a delicate dance. We were within the Justice Department investigating a president who was supervising that same Justice Department. The senior officials at the Justice Department who appointed the special counsel wanted to see the investigation done right, but they had the natural human desire not to impale and imperil their entire administration. So we had to work very delicately to find all the facts, get the investigation done, run through the traps and obstacles that were placed in our paths, and it was quite a challenge.
You're terrific because you're choosing your words very appropriately and concisely, as to what the politics that must have been going on behind that. And to the listener here, at some point the Mueller investigation ends. It ends. And what was the conclusion of this process?
The conclusion was a 2-volume report that the special counsel submitted to the Department of Justice. The first volume examined Russian interference in the 2016 election and links and coordination between the Trump campaign officials and Russians. And the conclusion of that investigation was that there was no prosecutable conspiracy between Trump campaign officials and confirmed Russian efforts to favor Trump over Hillary Clinton. But there were many areas of contact and conversation that required a fair amount of explanation to understand, and that had significant implications for the American political system and its healthy functioning without interference from a foreign adversary who's seeking to upend the democratic process. I think in many ways, Mueller thought that that was the more important of our 2 volumes because it was a warning to America that foreign nations have great capacity to infiltrate an open society and exploit political opportunities to skew the election and interfere with free choice among voters. And that was a lesson that he thought needed to be learned because other foreign adversaries and Russia itself would continue to upend our political processes for their own purposes. The second volume was about whether Trump had obstructed justice, namely our own investigation and other investigations. And on that one, the office decided that it would not make a recommendation on whether Trump had actually committed the crime of obstruction of justice, but instead would lay out the legal test for evaluating that issue, the constitutional considerations in whether a president can obstruct justice in the very executive branch that he supervises, and then provide a very detailed recitation of the events that were most prominent in the public eye. For example, President Trump fired then FBI Director James Comey when James Comey was engaged in supervising the investigation into interference in the election and links and coordination with the Trump campaign. He had urged Comey not to prosecute then National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who had lied about not having contacts with Russian Ambassador Kislyak when in fact he was taped having those kinds of contacts. There were efforts by the president to demonize witnesses against him, like his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, and to praise witnesses who he thought were refusing to cooperate with the government, like Paul Manafort, his former campaign manager. And we took all of those instances and analyzed them under the elements of obstruction of justice. Did not draw a conclusion about whether he would have been prosecuted had he not been president of the United States, and submitted that to the Justice Department, which ultimately, after a protracted period, provided the report to the American public and to Congress for Congress to make up its mind about the proper response to the conduct that we had described.
Is that one of the more intriguing assignments you've had?
It was one of the more difficult assignments that I had. I was one of the primary drafters of Volume 2 and a primary consultant on Volume 1. And this investigation was one of the most detailed, painstaking, and I think thorough and responsible investigations that the department had ever conducted. And trying to boil it down into a form that the American public could understand and that was true to constitutional values and Robert Mueller's insistence on ultimate rigor, ultimate candor, and accuracy was quite a process. We spent many nights, late at night, poring over single sentences. On the day that the report was due, I left the office at 5 a.m. and got a call at 6 a.m. to come back. We were still debating the exact language of one of the crucial sentences, and I came back and rewrote it and went into the report, and there it was.
Your assignment, Mueller's assignment, was investigation. Not a sense that if the investigation proved there had been an obstruction of justice, that you could proceed.
That's right.
So it was a fairly limited scope.
We actually brought, as an office, indictments against many Trump former campaign officials and Russians who did not show up to respond to the indictment, but for the hacking of the Democratic National Committee computers and the exfiltration of campaign documents and the dumping them through WikiLeaks, which was part of their effort to interfere with the campaign. So there was quite a bit of prosecution activity, but on the one key central figure, President Trump, the Department of Justice had a longstanding legal position that it articulated in 1973 with respect to Richard Nixon and had reaffirmed in 2020 with respect to President Clinton that a sitting president may not be subjected to criminal prosecution. And we did not try to challenge that legal position within the department, and we adhered to it in the final report. So that was among the factors that led us not to conclude whether President Trump had committed crimes. Instead, we laid out the facts for a future prosecutor, for Congress, and for the American public to evaluate for themselves.
Were you comfortable with that?
I personally thought that we should have completed our analysis and determined whether the president had, in fact, violated federal criminal law, but there were many competing views in the office, and the ultimate decision was not to go in that direction.
You were in the Solicitor General's office till 2019, ironically, and then in 2023 you returned to the Department of Justice, serve as counselor to Special Counsel Jack Smith, another high-profile case where represented the United States on a brief and an argument on Trump versus United States.
Correct.
And again, maybe for the camera, because I have the expert here, maybe give it a little background on the case and the issue.
In this special counsel investigation, the target proved to be a former president of the United States, and the Department of Justice had no legal position that a former president could not be prosecuted either for his private conduct or his official acts. And Jack Smith, before I got to the office, determined to seek and obtained an indictment for fraudulent activities in connection with the 2020 election that consisted of 5 phases of fraudulent activity, culminating in the January 6th assault on the Capitol, which followed a speech by President Trump on the Ellipse in which he encouraged his supporters to fight like hell, or we're not going to have a country anymore, and we're going to march up to the Capitol. And the ensuing riot was, of course, captured on national television. And even after the riot, Trump's supporters sought to delay and derail the electoral certification of Joe Biden as president of the United States. So the indictment targeted that conduct through three separate legal theories. They were all based on very similar conduct. One theory was that President Trump had committed fraud on the United States by claiming that he won the election when he knew that he had not. And there was a vast amount of evidence that he had lost the election, that his claims of election irregularities were unfounded, and that he knew that. So there was a theory of fraud. There was a theory of obstruction of justice, in that the certification of the election was an official function of the United States government, and he sought to obstruct that both through fraudulent activity and through the actual stimulation and instigation of the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. And the third theory was it was a deprivation of the right of American citizens to have their votes counted, because had Trump's scheme succeeded, the millions of people who voted for Joe Biden would have had their votes nullified by a scheme that was based on misconduct and fraud. So that indictment had been filed before I got to the office. Trump, in response, asserted that he had a form of immunity from prosecution for acts that he committed in his official capacity while he was president. And that theory had been argued to the district court, and Judge Chutkan had rejected it. And I arrived at the office at a moment when the case was on appeal, and everyone thought that it was destined for the Supreme Court. And the department determined that Jack Smith's office should have somebody on board who was a Supreme Court specialist and who knew something about criminal law. And I was kind of in the Venn diagram for that assignment.
Did you welcome it?
I thought it would be an incredible challenge and an incredible honor. There really is very little in the law that is a higher honor than representing the United States before the United States Supreme Court. I had loved being in the Solicitor General's office. I would go to work, not on every day, but on most days, just feeling a sense of awe entering the Department of Justice. The opportunity to work with people who are dedicated to doing the right thing and who want to get to the bottom of legal issues, the most important legal issues that I thought the government was facing in that era in criminal law, was a breath of fresh air for me. So I did accept that assignment, and I was grateful to be able to work again with dedicated colleagues in the Department of Justice.
I guess for the camera, I should ask the question, how did the Supreme Court rule?
The Supreme Court largely rejected our position and held that the president does have immunity for what it called core official acts of the president, acts that Congress can't regulate and the courts can't review. It gave a small set of those instances, and some of them had been charged in the indictment as part of the criminal scheme, and the court said we cannot do that. The court said that all other official conduct within the outer perimeter of the broad expanse of the president's duties was at least presumptively immune, which meant that we would have to overcome a presumption of immunity by showing that prosecuting the president for that conduct would not infringe on his Article II responsibilities. And then the court might later decide that even that is not good enough, that he needs full immunity. The one piece of the case that was successful was that the court reaffirmed that private conduct by the president is not immune, even though he is the then president of the United States. And a large part of the indictment charging the election fraud was based on the theory that Trump was acting as candidate rather than as president in seeking to reinstate himself as a second-term president, despite the fact that he lost the election. So after the Supreme Court ruled, Jack Smith and the team rewrote the indictment to eliminate the things that the Supreme Court said could not be prosecuted, to try to bolster the case for overcoming a presumption of immunity for the remaining official acts, and for making clear that the heart of the case was the allegation that Trump had committed crimes in his capacity as candidate rather than in his capacity as president.
Where did that end up?
That ended up being never adjudicated because Trump won his second term, and under the Department of Justice legal position that a sitting president cannot be subject to criminal prosecution for anything, private or official conduct, Jack Smith filed a motion to dismiss the indictment shortly before Trump took office, and the case was dismissed.
You've written an article, Robert Jackson, we're at the Robert Jackson Center. Robert Jackson's The Federal Prosecutor Revisited. And what motivated you to do that?
I was invited to write on the article. The Harvard Law Forum had decided to do a series of symposium articles looking back on this famous speech, which of course I had read several times when I was in the Department of Justice, but had not really gone back to study. And when they invited me to write on it, I thought this would be a great opportunity to revisit one of the most elegant writers who had expressed a fundamental ethos of what it means to be a Department of Justice lawyer that echoed down through the years and was read by almost everybody who does federal criminal law in the Department of Justice. And I was very open to taking a look at it and trying to assess its significance today.
Did you learn something by rereading it? I mean, here's something that you don't memorize it, but everybody's talked about it. And for the cameras, on April 1st, 1940, Attorney General Robert H. Jackson gave a speech to the federal prosecutors, about 100 or so there in the Great Hall, and which then got reduced to writing, and that's what we're talking about.
I reread the speech 5 or 6 times at least in the course of writing the article, and I learned new things every time I reread it. It is so rich. One of Jackson's great gifts was being able to express things very concisely with arresting images and concrete detail. And the article weaves in endless numbers of insights about the way the Department of Justice functions. Just as a backdrop, the Department of Justice is a very unusual agency. It's headed by an attorney general, but it has now 93 United States attorneys who are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. Almost all of them have their own political power bases. Almost all of them consider themselves the equal of the attorney general and the lords of the manor for their own districts. And so in many ways, I thought of it while I was in the department as a kind of loose analog to the Soviet Union. There was kind of a central government, but there were far-flung provinces that were very difficult to govern. And Jackson knew that when he stood up to talk to these people. He knew that they were all very independent, all very proud, and he wanted to instill in them certain values that he thought were of national significance, and at the same time wanted to show his respect for their independence and desire to address the local problems as they saw fit without interference from Washington. So he was walking a tightrope, and he managed to appeal to their vanity, remind them of higher values, talk to them about the perils of being a federal prosecutor with potential politicization of who you go after, and left them with a very inspiring call to look to their own integrity as the greatest source of their reputation, which would be the stepping stone to their future careers. It was really a miraculous weaving together of different messages, and he did this all when he was just a very new attorney general. His experience in the department was not at the top. He had been head of two different components of the department, and I'm sure he well understood the dynamics, but it showed his great gift for human insight and an important message and how to deliver it in a way that would have lasting impact.
I'm going to read something from your Harvard Law Review Forum article. It said, he painted a picture of a prosecutor who understands her vast power, but tempers it with restraint and fairness. Across administrations, attorneys general have quoted the speech as the timeless touchstone of the Department of Justice's ethos. Jackson's words live up to the billing. They reflect his gift for combining plain speech with eloquent and memorable epigrams. You hear vignettes of his speech used a lot, from a lot of different contexts. And this was in 1940. Mm-hmm. Here we are in 2026. The Department of Justice may be using those same words, but are they in a different frame of mind? Are they in a different place?
We are in a very different place, I think, than the department has been for many decades. And the words of Jackson, I think, are particularly important now as a reminder to people who have the privilege to serve in the Department of Justice that, as many people have pointed out, it's the only cabinet agency that's named for a value, not a function. We're not the Department of Agriculture, we're the Department of Justice. And people who walk the halls see portraits of past attorneys general, past solicitors general. There are many murals from the WPA era that depict justice. And it can't help but leave you with a sense that you're part of something that's greater than you. You have become part of a tradition that stands for something incredibly important in America, not just in American law. So I think that Jackson's speech deserves to be remembered, and will it be lived up to in every single instance? We are human beings. And I think that one feature of the legal landscape that is somewhat different now than it has been in past administrations is most presidents have respected that an independent Department of Justice is essential to the fair and impartial administration of the law. This administration takes a different view of the relationship between the White House and the Attorney General, and the Attorney General has transmitted that philosophy throughout the Justice Department. And that's a real break with tradition. There are costs associated with imperiling the public's belief that the Justice Department is doing things for legal reasons rather than political reasons. And I hope to see the department get back on track in the future.
I learned a lot from the article, but one of the things I really found interesting, because today we assume that Jackson's words in 1940 resonated and kind of hit the headlines and therefore became kind of a new standard, when in fact you were quick to point out, as inspirational as Jackson's words were, they did not immediately assume iconic status, and there really was just a moment in time in 1988.
Yes, that's one of the things that I discovered when I was working on this piece. I had assumed that everyone had taken Jackson's words down as the two tablets from Mount Sinai, and that all new prosecutors from time immemorial had known them. But it turned out that until Justice Scalia wrote his famous dissent in Morrison versus Olson in 1988, the speech was known by cognoscenti, but not by that many others. What turned out happened is that a brief was filed in Morrison versus Olson, which is of course the case about the constitutionality of the independent counsel statute, by three former attorneys general, led by Ed Levy, and a lawyer in Chicago who had written the brief for him, who was a former assistant to the Solicitor General, who I knew. And I got in touch with him and said, hey, where did this speech came from? He said, it's really a great question. I have no idea. Probably Ed Levy. So Ed Levy, of course, was a very cerebral and knowledgeable attorneys general, and who thought about the role in ways that are larger than just the immediate problems that an attorney general faced, was well aware of that speech and quoted it at great length in the amicus brief. And Justice Scalia picked it up and he quoted it. And I think it's after that that it entered Department of Justice lore and consciousness and became the famous speech that it is today.
I'm reading your footnote right now. Footnote number 30, page 177, for those who want to look at it. Because I had not noticed this, but the Solicitor General at the time was Charles Freed. And he highlighted the speech in his oral arguments, describing it as, quote, that splendid address to young prosecutors. I mean, part of his presentation to the court. Charles Freed was here because he sat in that same chair that you're currently in. So to connect everything all together, well, are there, we read about it, and certainly it's in the press, liberal, conservative, but they talk about the influence of the executive, because it is part of the executive branch, and whether or not one can take comfort in the fact there's guardrails in the Department of Justice. And I know you wrote a little bit about that, and could you comment on that?
One of the things that I think we have learned in this current administration is that the guardrails against politicization of the department or departures from the traditions of impartiality are very fragile. They are less grounded in law and more grounded in norms and traditions. And when I was at the department, you never really thought about that because there were exemplar figures who everybody knew and everyone wanted to emulate and to live up to their standards. And they just exuded the ethical traditions of the department. And you learned from watching them what they were, and you assumed that they are, the ironclad rules of the road in the Department of Justice. But in fact, there's very little legal protection for having a boundary between the White House and the Department of Justice. There are many scholars now who are attempting to develop theories that the White House does have to respect the independence of the Department of Justice. None of those has been accepted by courts. They haven't really had the opportunity to look at them. I'm not sure where that will land. But at least in the short term, the power of the president under Article 2 and the power of the Attorney General, derivative from the president, shows that norms are fragile. And what we need to maintain a culture of adherence to the rule of law are people whose bedrock beliefs are in the integrity of what they are doing. And they have to test and reaffirm that every day and test it against other people to ensure that that happens. And I do think that it is possible to reinstate that, but it's going to take a rededication to the traditional values of the department to accomplish it.
I'll just draw a closure because you've been more than gracious with your time. In your review, in the end, Jackson may have been right when he suggested that the personal commitment of federal prosecutors to fair play and sportsmanship was, quote, perhaps the best protection against the abuse of power. But he wrote those words in a very different era. And you conclude only time will tell whether today the protection is enough.
That's right. What we have seen is pressure placed on people who are following the best traditions of the department to bend their ethics to accommodate the current administration's priorities. Many of them have resigned. Some of them have found what their own personal red lines are and refuse to cross them, but otherwise are respecting the chain of command within the Department of Justice. I would hope to see some legal structures that help bolster pure personal ethical integrity. I think that it takes a little bit more than just a bedrock belief in yourself as an ethical person to behave ethically all the time. It helps to have institutional structures. And when I was at the department, there was no question. It was an institution. It was built into the DNA of the place, and it was transmitted from generation to generation by the figures who were the keepers of the flame of the department. And there are still a lot of people in the world who have that and would be ready to go back to a Department of Justice to reinstate that philosophy.
Thank you very much. This has been spectacular. Welcome to the Jackson Center, and I
Thank
hope
you.
you enjoy your stay here.
Thank you so much.